When you've been playing Dungeons & Dragons for as long as I have, you've seen the game's language evolve over time in a really interesting way. It's a great example of the difference between natural language and game language in tabletop role-playing games. Hi, I'm Peter, creator and lead designer of Tales from Elsewhere, and in today's video I'm going to be discussing the ideological differences between natural language and game language for articulating the rules to the reader. I'll define these terms and show you some examples from across different editions of Dungeons & Dragons, as well as some of its newest competitors like Drawsteel and Daggerheart. Alright, let's roll up our sleeves, open up Excalidraw, and start thinking through how we present our rules to the readers. As always on this YouTube channel, first let's define some terms and explore them a little bit. The first of which is game language. And I'm using this term to describe when a tabletop role-playing game's rules are communicated in a artificial or overly game-like manner. They're not attempting to construct a natural sentence that would be spoken casually. It uses charts and graphs and symbols and icons to communicate expediently what might take a long time to unpack if you were to write it all out in natural language. And a great example of this comes from 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons. If we look at one of the powers you can have, say I think this is a fighter power, it's presented in a card format. So we can see that there's a lot of keywords and symbols here to represent how this works. There is a single natural language sentence at the top to sort of give you the in-world fiction, but overall this is presented quite mechanically. And this resembles significantly what you see in Drawsteel abilities. Drawsteel abilities, since they use no null results, give you various keywords and then a series of numerical ranges on your d20 that provides various effects. And this is primarily presented in a very mechanical fashion. But you can see that these two bear a lot of similarities, right? They're both very gamist in the way that they present the information. They're not necessarily going for something immersive, we might say, but they're also very effective as reference tools when you're at the table. And that's the great value of game language. When you have something that communicates in symbols and numbers very quickly what you would need when trying to run this at your table. On the other hand, natural language is when you're attempting to construct something that rolls off the tongue a little bit easier, that you're meant to almost read aloud to understand how it works, using more of a real sentence to describe it. And natural language is something you've seen in pretty much every edition of D&D from 3rd edition to 3.5, skipping 4th edition, and into 5e and the 2024 rules. They tend to favor more natural language explanations of how things are done. For example, in Chill Touch, which by the way they finally made a touch range spell, it still does necrotic damage, not cold damage, so they've only half fixed this, but that's a rant for another time maybe. The Chill Touch spell says, channeling the chill of the grave, make a spell attack against a target within reach. On a hit, the target takes 1d10 necrotic damage and it can't regain hit points until the end of your next turn. That is a sentence, that is prose, that it's attempting to use to communicate how the spell works. And because of that, it sounds more natural to read off. Compared to, say, what we were looking at in 4th edition, which is a little bit more of a game language. You have to read it down the list, saying target 1 creature, attack, strength versus AC, hit is 1 weapon damage plus strength modifier. It's a little bit more artificial. The drawback is you have to read the paragraph to extract the actual rules information. At a glance, how much damage does Chill Touch do? You need to find it within a couple sentences within a paragraph. Natural language is nice because it can help teach the players how to communicate the rule systems to one another. It helps integrate it into their minds by using sentence structure and terms that more naturally fit the way that they would conceptualize the world, we might say. But that drawback is a lack of immediate clarity and accessibility that iconography or abbreviations and icons can really help communicate. And I think if we look at a Daggerheart domain card, we can see that there's a little bit of both. Daggerheart domain cards resemble 4th edition power cards in a lot of ways. They're a discrete packet of what you can do, how often they can be used, what they cost, and so forth, but they use much more natural language. So here we have the Tempest spell that does use some natural language to present itself. Choose one of the following Tempests and make a spell cast roll against all targets within far range. Targets you succeed against experience its effects until the GM spends a fear on their turn to end this spell. There are game keywords within this paragraph: spell cast roll, far range, as it uses abstracted range bands, the GM spending fear to end the spell, and then it has a bullet point list of what different effects you can cause, each of which is mostly written in a natural language sense, like deal 2d20 plus 8 magic damage and targets are temporarily vulnerable. Again, that's natural language versus simply having riders and symbols to each item that use icons and so forth. And now, putting all 4 of these on the same view here, I think really articulates the point I'm trying to make. All 4 of these are attempting to communicate a discrete ability the player has access to in their respective systems, and they've all done so in very different ways. In theory, none of them is all that much more complicated than any of the others. I mean, I chose an at-will power here for the fighter, so it's inherently a little simple, but they're all trying to give you the information you would need to use this spell or ability. And I don't think any one of these is superior to the others. These are different approaches to game design and game experience that I think are all valid. But I think we need to be cautious about leaning too far in one direction such that you lose some evocation or you lose clarity. As with so many things in game design, you need to approach it with intentionality. I actually like natural language rules a lot. I like when they roll off the tongue a little bit more naturally, when it feels like when I communicate what I'm going to do in the game, it comes off as something natural in describing the action versus communicating a series of symbols and numbers. But at the same time, I know there's a heavy cost to the usability of that structure. So like so many things, it's picking your poison. Now, another rule structure we could examine within Dungeons & Dragons is hiding and sneaking, as I started playing back in the 3rd edition days, and we can take a look at just how much the language around being sneaky has changed over time. And while still remaining mostly in natural language, we can see that, well, sometimes the natural language runs a little long. So let's look at 3.5 edition here. This is the hide action. It's a lot. Don't bother trying to read every little detail here, but it is quite a bit of text. We'll go through just a bit of it. Your hide check is opposed by the spot check of anyone who might see you. You can move up to 1/2 your normal speed and hide at no penalty. When moving at a speed greater than 1/2 but less than your normal speed, you take a -5 penalty. It's practically impossible, a -20 penalty, to hide while attacking, running, or charging. And then it goes through all sorts of exceptions and what's required, and if there's people observing you, even casually, you can't hide. There's all sorts of stipulations here that are written in prose, making it quite hard to parse how to actually hide at any given time. And what's really interesting is it doesn't really talk about the results of hiding in this block of text. What does hiding do in the system? It doesn't actually communicate that very effectively here in this rules block, yet it goes on for what seems like ages. In 4th edition, they cut it down and use the more game-like structure that 4th edition is known for. We now have a series of bullet points that help articulate this, making it a little easier to find what you need, like it notes an opposed check, stealth versus passive perception. It doesn't write out that this is opposed by those who could view you. It's going for a more expedient but still largely natural language in its approach. And it says the results are, the success, you are hidden, which means you are silent and invisible to the enemy. You see concealment and so forth. So we see the game moving into this 4th edition ideology, which is teetering on the more game-like approach, even in how it describes your skills. In 2024, we have more of a full commitment to natural language with a few exceptions within it. So the hide action says, with the hide action, you try to conceal yourself. To do so, you must succeed on a DC 15 dexterity stealth check while you're heavily obscured or behind 3/4 cover or total cover, and you must be out of an enemy's line of sight. If you can see a creature, you can discern whether it can see you. Now, that all was very natural language and somewhat intuitive. You need to have some sort of cover and concealment. If you can see something, you'd be able to gauge if they can see you, and so forth. Now, in 2024 rules, where they've entered into a bit more of the gamist language, is this next paragraph, where it says, on a successful check, you have the invisible condition while hidden. That sentence doesn't really make a lot of sense outside of the context of a tabletop role-playing game. While you're hidden, you are invisible. You have the invisible condition. That feels a little bit more odd, don't you think? But we can see how this hide action structure is significantly more condensed and more natural sounding than the 4th edition one, and of course, way better than this hide action from the 3.5 days. So natural language can really work against you if you go for a very verbose and long-winded approach to describing it, trying to account for every little exception and every little corner case that you could, like this 3.5 edition era one. And we can compare all of those various D&D stealth rules to the stealth rules in the game Mothership, which I will put up on the screen now. There aren't any. This is somewhat notorious in Mothership, that there aren't rules that govern die rolls for hiding yourself or sneaking by something, because the intention is it is a negotiation between the players and the GM, or the warden as they call it in that game, about what would actually hide you in a situation. You need to describe in detail what you do to hide yourself, like opening up a locker, removing its contents and slipping inside and closing the door, or climbing up into the air ducts and closing the gate behind you, or stacking garbage in front of you and hiding underneath it in an abandoned room. You're supposed to have this conversation, and the GM then adjudicates whether or not that was sufficient. And there's not any text to explain it. So I'm just pointing that out because natural language or very crunchy and game type language are all attempting to define something in various levels of gradation. But there also exists this idea of leaving things purely open to adjudication at the table, which is the most loose and open-ended version possible of a rule structure. Coming back to these 3 abilities we looked at the start of the video, Chill Touch, Crushing Surge, and Draconian Pride. All of these are very valid ways of presenting your rules, but one or the other might end up pushing you more toward the paper button style of role-playing game. Now, a lot of people use the paper button term in a derogatory manner, and I'm not using it in that way here. A paper button is where you're using an ability and not engaging necessarily with a narrative of how that ability works or anything like that. You're pushing the button and a prescribed effect occurs that then the GM just instantiates. That it doesn't necessarily engage in a creative process between you and the game world. And that is okay. The entire 4th edition D&D version was nothing but paper buttons, and I had a blast in that game. Draw Steel is a lot of what we would describe as paper buttons. What you can do, the way you interact with the world, is contained within these chunks of rules packets, like Crushing Surge from 4th edition, Draconian Pride. Those leave less room for improvisation with how those abilities interact in the universe. Something like Chill Touch can open things up more, but that's not inherent to natural language. What Chill Touch can do here is actually quite limited. It only is range touch. You attack a target within your reach, and on hit it does 1d10 necrotic damage, and the target can't regain hit points till the end of your next turn. It doesn't talk about, say, freezing a lock with your hand because it's so cold, making it more brittle to break it. It doesn't actually provide room for improvisation either. It all depends on how you've created a concrete or open-ended rule structure for the players. So some people say that the paper button style, like say in Draconian Pride, is too limited, and so they want to use natural language. But when you write a natural language rule, it doesn't necessarily make it more open-ended and prone to improvisation and roleplay. It's more about how concrete you make what it does. And again, that's not to say that one is better or worse, they just fulfill different purposes. So even if you're on the natural language side or the game language side of rules presentation, consider how limiting your abilities are and the rule structures you're presenting, how much you give the players and the GMs ammunition to go beyond just what the rules say on the page in a structured manner. Because that's where I think really good abilities come into their own, where yes, there's a concrete floor of what they accomplish, a foundation, but you feel like you can use your imagination on where to go beyond that without just going outside of the rules entirely. Well, as always, I hope you found that interesting. I'd love to know what your thoughts are on the game language versus natural language approach. Do you have a preference? And if you're working on your own game, which one are you erring on the side of? And while you're down there, consider hitting the like and subscribe button, the usual YouTube pleasantries. And if you'd like to get more out of this YouTube channel, consider joining the Patreon, where I release an additional video every week on some other tabletop role-playing game design topic, or dev updates on the game I'm working on, just unfiltered and unedited additional videos that we release every week. Well, regardless, I hope you enjoyed all of this, and I will see you here next week on Tales from Elsewhere.